Hello together and welcome back to the Philosophy Show. So today Christoffer and I have decided to talk about mutualism, which is a special economic theory that is kind of neither exactly capitalist nor exactly socialist, but it's a different economic theory. And Christoffer has read a book, or to a large extent, and he will now briefly introduce the topic and perhaps the main points of this book, and then we will kind of delve into this economic theory.
Great, thank you, Amos. Yes, so this is the book. It is called Studies in Mutualist Political Economy by Kevin A. Carson. And it also has a quote below here: "The natural wage of labor is its product," by a 19th century individualist anarchist called Benjamin R. Tucker. And this quote is very relevant to understanding mutualism. So we can begin with understanding mutualism itself and its basic principles. So the way we could understand mutualism is that it's an economic theory or economic philosophy which argues that we could have a society in which we do have free markets. That is, we have enterprises, we have money, people trading goods and services and using money, but it is not a capitalist market. It is a market in which you have laborers having their own property, so to speak, their own local or small or individual enterprise or business that they run individually or with the family, or alternatively, some form of worker cooperatives where the workers collectively own the means of production in their own small firm, and then they sell those products on the market and they exchange it. So what is interesting about this mutualist theory is that it is neither capitalist nor state socialist, but it still supports a free market. The idea is that a free market doesn't necessarily it doesn't have to entail that you need to have these capitalist hierarchies with capital owners, and then you have bosses, and then you have workers working for a wage and not owning the means of production. The idea is that you can actually combine worker control of the means of production with a free market. So that would be mutualism in its basic principles. And this fascinated me when I began looking into this some years ago, because I used to be a radical libertarian myself. I believed in radically free markets, no government intervention. And mutualism was interesting because it's sort of left-wing in economics. It criticizes capitalism and strong financial hierarchies and concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, etc. But it still says we should have an unregulated free market, that these are actually able to be combined. So it sort of offers a way for both right-wing libertarians and socialists, communists, or some other form of leftists, like left-wing anarchists, to have some common cause. So yes, that would be the very general idea of mutualism, and then it has some very interesting components to that. For instance, the idea of mutual credit, a new way of looking at banking and money. It's against the idea of owning land without occupying it. So it has a very interesting theory of how do you acquire private property and what would be considered illegitimate ownership of land, etc. So yes, we could deal more into that, but this is, I suppose, the general idea behind mutualism.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and it does sound very interesting. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about it as we have this conversation, because for example, this idea just brief that people shouldn't be allowed to own land if they are not using it. I think I have been thinking about this myself, that ownership should kind of be able to degrade if it's not being used. So that's just one point that I found interesting, and I would like to go into more. Now, I did have a big question, or just a first question. Would this Carson, would he say that it should be illegal to have someone else work for you by using your own means of production? Or how would he look at this? Because let's say we have this worker cooperative. There are like 5 people, each has his own family, and they work together and produce some furniture in a furniture shop. Now, if, for example, one of these, and the shop is owned by all 5 of them. Now, let's say one of them has perhaps a drinking problem, so he uses up too much money, and he starts borrowing money from his friend. Then, and at some point, when he cannot pay back the money, he will say, well, okay, I will give you my share of this workshop. But would he then no longer be allowed to work in the workshop, or how does he envision this?
That's a good question. So I think the mutualists, like Dr. or Mr. Carson, would say that it's quite legal, or it's acceptable for workers to have some sort of contract with other people. They can abandon their share of a business, and they can choose to work for some person who's above them and directs them and guides them and become their boss, so to speak. But what Carson and others argue is that this would be very unlikely to happen in a mutualist free market, because the idea is that you could ask the question, why would workers, generally speaking, want to work for a boss instead of working for themselves? Now, according to the mutualist, the idea is that if you had the option of having some piece of land yourself, having some piece of property and capital yourself, you would prefer to work that and earn the full product of that business or enterprise you work on, instead of letting some business owner or capitalist taking the product for you and the income for you, and you simply receiving a wage. Now, I myself, I'm a bit skeptical to this idea. So yeah, I think we discussed this some years ago in our conversation we had, that you could challenge this premise, but at least the idea would be that either this would be the case, that if you had a possibility of creating your own business or having worker cooperatives, and that would be far more easy than it is today in the mutualist free market, people would generally prefer to live that way. And if you did have capitalists hiring workers for a wage, the competition among capitalists for workers would be so strong and intense that the wages would be very high. And Kevin Carson actually quotes some very interesting things from the 18th and early 19th century in England and in the United States, where, especially in the United States, land was very cheap because there was a lot of available land for newcomers. And therefore, it was very difficult for capitalists to obtain large amounts of workers to work for a business, because people would rather prefer to get some piece of land and work on that land themselves and be completely self-sufficient. So that's, Carson argues in his book that it's due to state expropriation of land and manipulation intervention in the economy on behalf of capitalists that this changed, and that people were far more dependent upon capitalists than before. And also I could mention very briefly, there is a German sociologist, or was a German sociologist named Franz Oppenheimer. And he argued in a similar fashion that as long as there is available fertile land in the world, or at least in the country in which you live, then we would expect people to rather occupy and cultivate this land instead of being hired by someone else who owns some other piece of land, that they would rather be self-sufficient on their own land and working for someone else on their land. And since there are a lot of available land that is not occupied in the world, that means that, well, there has to be some political means by which this process is prevented. I could also briefly show one book that Franz Oppenheimer wrote was The State, Its History and Development Viewed Sociologically. So it's a sort of anarchist idea of how the state came to be through, it argues, violence and conquest. So it's an interesting insight into the anarchist way of looking at these things. Now, just so that the audience know, I myself, I'm no longer an anarchist, and I do not support the mutualist philosophy, generally speaking, in its totality or principles, but I think it offers some very interesting and valuable insights, at least in some of these points. So, yes.
Yes, very interesting. Yeah, I think just we can go with the assumption for the idea of exploring the mutualist theory further, but I think we have also mentioned this in other conversations. We have come to this conclusion that the assumptions about human nature are very fundamental to every theory. And so I guess I wouldn't agree with the assumption or with some assumptions about human nature that seem to be that Carson seems to make, and especially the one, of course, right now in this instant, if you have two options as a general worker, either you can work for yourself and earn the entire profits of what you are doing for yourself, or you can work for someone else and kind of only earn a third of the profits that your work produces, then naturally everyone will prefer the first option. But if you look at long-term planning and long-term thinking, there are absolutely a lot of people who seem almost incapable of really planning or thinking long-term. So these are the people that will lease an expensive car because they think, then I can have this expensive car now, instead of first having to work for 3 years before I can buy it. But they don't understand that when they are leasing it, they are actually paying far more in total than if they would first save and then buy the car. And these are people who will, I don't know, do things that are perhaps agreeable in the short term, but detrimental even to their business that they own in the long term. And or some people will neglect to keep their business relations in a good order if they are independent, and then they won't have good business relations, and then they will end up going into bankruptcy and then being hired by someone else. And it's not because they want to be hired by someone else, but because they aren't equally well equipped themselves to plan for the long-term future. So I think that might be a fundamental disagreement that I would have with Carson, or perhaps he would have some answer to this.
Right, so that's a very interesting and good point. And yeah, I think Carson would have some different views on human nature in that regard. He would argue, like he does in the book, that if you had workers who truly owned the product of their business, either they owned it themselves and an individual business, or had a worker cooperative, where you have a group of workers collectively owning the means of production and sharing the product among themselves instead of being hired by capitalists. He argues that the workers would be more motivated to be productive on the job because they feel that they have more say in what is happening. And that when you have a worker who is very strictly controlled by a capitalist, that he would be less motivated to do a good job because he feels like he's being controlled by another instead of being the one being in control himself, so to speak. And he quotes some other people who pointed out that when the modern industrial revolution came about, there was a radical change in the lives of workers, because before the industrial revolution, many of those workers or the generations before them worked as peasants on places like common lands, where you had parts of land, the land where you had peasants operating on that land together. And they had a lot of free time and ways they could control their own labor freely. But then when it got the Industrial Revolution, now due to things that Carson discussed a lot in this book, they were forced into the factories, where now they had to be very strictly controlled and regulated by some business owner or boss. And this would actually worsen their conditions and their way of life, and thus they would be less motivated, and the quality of their life and their productivity, etc., would be worse. So yeah, I think he would believe, and I think this reflects a more leftist point of view, generally speaking, that if you have the right type of political and economic conditions, then you would have productivity and creativity unleashed, that people will be more productive and better at doing things like planning and living happier lives if we were to do this or that political and economic change. So I think he could be understood in that general leftist philosophy. Now, so certainly he wouldn't say that everything is going to be perfect. Obviously, that people are going to have flaws and defects, but he would argue that it would be better compared to what we have today to have such a mutualist system. And also a brief point which can help to understand the mutualist approach is that a basic principles in economics is the idea of supply and demand. Supply is things being produced on the market for a specific price. And demand is consumers being willing to buy those things for given a specific price that they have to pay. And the higher the supply is compared to the demand, then it will be cheaper, because the producers will have to compete with one another to sell all the products to the consumers. But if the demand is very high compared to the supply, then the supply would be more scarce and more demanded, so it would be more valuable in the market, and therefore the price will go up. And the idea is that if you use this economic logic to the labor market, the supply are the laborers, the workers who produce labor, and then you have the demand, which is the capitalists or the business owners who demand their labor. The price of that labor would be the wage of that labor. The idea is that if you had mutualist free markets, there would be so many options for the workers that the supply would be far lower compared to demand, because there are so many other things the worker can do instead of just working at the corporation. And thus, the demand for labor would be much higher than the supply of labor, which would mean the wages would be far higher and the conditions would be much better. So that's a very brief presentation of some economic principle that the mutualist would generally abide by. So yeah.
Yes, I mean, I do understand that idea that if more people were kind of self-sufficient or having their own small enterprise that they own themselves, then there would be less people willing to work for someone else. And as you said, then the price of labor would go up. So I do understand that point. And it is, of course, also necessary to remark that I think the number of people who are self-employed is very much artificially decreased nowadays, and perhaps it has also been in the past. I don't know enough, but certainly nowadays it is artificially decreased by laws that are active in our society. And one example might be that there is a crazy amount of paperwork that you need to fill out for every type of product that you can sell. And this is a bigger burden for a small independent producer than for a large corporation. And we have talked about similar things in past videos. There are many examples. The whole patent system is another example that really works to hinder small independent businesses from existing. So yeah, and in my mind also it would be far preferable if more people were financially independent, because you can make a very strong argument that a good democracy, a stable democracy, can only function when people are financially independent. Because if they are dependent on a few very large corporations, then these corporations can influence their political behavior by threatening to quit them or to throw them out of their job. And of course, then the state and the large enterprise can start to cooperate for their mutual advantage and to exclude the general public from this advantage. And so, yeah, that's just a couple of thoughts here.
Yeah, interesting points there. So here I would go a little bit into what Kevin Carson discusses when it comes to the history of the Industrial Revolution and why the economy is structured the way it is. And here I think he has some very, very valuable and good insights on this point, because it seems to be the case among both certain right-wing libertarians and liberals, generally speaking, and social democrats, that the Industrial Revolution and the modern industrial economic structure was formed by and large by a free market, by capitalists investing their labor, and then you had workers who decided to work in those factories, and you had competition, and you have free trade and free markets, and that's why you had a structure in this. It is, and right libertarians would say yes, and this is why the 19th century was so great and so much economic growth, because it was much freer than today. You had this term laissez-faire, this French term describing a very free market economy. That is the idea. And the liberals would also agree that yes, the 19th century was relatively free market laissez-faire, but look at all the problems. You had poverty, you had oppression of workers. That's why it was so great that we have the progressive state presenting government regulation and social security and welfare state measures, etc. Kevin Carson, he completely argues against and he challenges this premise altogether, that there truly was any kind of free market in the 19th century or at any point in the last 500 years. He argues that the reason why you had so many workers work in the factories in the 19th century, the reason why the proletariat became a thing, was because the peasants who worked on lands, those lands were expropriated by the states, under King Henry VIII and the British Parliament later on, where you had aristocrats and the state enclosing huge parts of land which were previously collectively organized and owned by some local community instead of farmers. But then the state just took them over and gave them to certain wealthy aristocrats who used them for capitalist purposes, apparently. Thus, the idea is that the peasants were now without the land, they were without the means of subsistence, which forced them into seeking jobs in the factories and being very desperate. And he also argues that in the United States, you had huge parts of uncultivated land, which were just taken by a state and given to wealthy business owners. So, and here is a principle in mutualism that in order to gain legitimate private property rights, you need to cultivate land. You can't just say, all of this land is mine and I can see. You actually have to do something to the land in order to claim it to be yours. So when a state just says, this land belongs to us, and now we're going to, quote, privatize it, giving to some wealthy business owner, that is actually illegitimate private property. And hence the idea is that the government in this way prevents people from having other ways of living and having alternatives to the job by exploring this land and using it.
Yes, interesting points that you have brought up here again. And yeah, it is interesting. And of course, there were at all times in human societies, or in most societies at least, some form of aristocracy or some group of people who are very much richer or wealthier than the general public, who have a lot of resources at their disposal. And it seems that this just kind of happens always in human societies. And of course, these people who have a lot of resources, they are oftentimes very, very smart or very industrious or very well connected. And they use their resources to make sure that they will stay in this position of being the aristocracy in the future, or perhaps that their children will stay in the aristocracy or something like that. And so it is an interesting question. How exactly did this transfer happen historically from a feudal society where many people were kind of, they were basically part of the property of the land of the aristocracy. And then at some point this shifted to the industrial society. But of course, the aristocrats were not just sitting idly and doing nothing during this whole change. So it's an interesting question. How did they use their influence and their connections to the government? Because the aristocracy is always over proportionally represented or connected to the government. So how did they use this these options that they have to make sure that they will remain the aristocracy also in the changing social order? So I do not know enough about it historically. I do know, however, that there were a couple of occasions where the factory owners called upon the government, and the government sent the military to break the strike of the workers. So there definitely was a certain intervention by the government on behalf of the factory owners, because yeah, they basically forced the workers back into the factory using the army when they were striking. So that did happen during the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, I did have another point, but I just forgot it, so perhaps it will come back.
Right, yes. So I think these considerations are very, very valuable. And this was also important for my own shift in worldview and thinking about things, especially when I got from being right-wing libertarian to gradually getting to the journey to which I ended up here I am today, because it shows that contrary to what some say right-wing libertarians and also generally liberals and neoconservatives, etc., would think, it's not like we have a generally free market economy and then we have just a little bit of government regulation and intervention on the top of that. Rather, it's almost the opposite way around. It was not the case that this modern industrial big business finance capitalism came about through some natural process, or the government just took its hands off the business and then suddenly, boom, you had modern industry. But rather it was massively formed and structured due to massive government intervention. And he points that out both with this land expropriation issue, and then he gets on toward also mentioning things like colonialism and how important that was in establishing a global market and for businesses to put out their products and dump their products to other countries and do all these things to establish a world market dominated by Great Britain initially, and so on. And then he argues, for instance, that patents have been very, very essential in establishing the oligarchical structure of the business economy today, where you have huge, large corporations owning a lot of patents, which prevent small business owners and other people to compete with them on many products because they have a patent. You're not allowed to use their technology in any way. Now, the issue of patents is a huge discussion in and of itself, and that though there could be many interesting points drawn from that discussion, but briefly, I would say that Kevin Carson argues that patents actually hinder innovation as much as it helps to promote it. And yeah, that would perhaps be a separate discussion, but that's at least some challenging issues. And he also argued that infrastructure has been largely government tax funded, determined. For instance, the railroads were there because government gave huge amounts of aid to railroad companies and land just granted to them. And the road system, the interstate highway system in the United States, completely tax owned. And when one thinks about it, economically speaking, tax funded roads, tax funded airplanes, etc., are actually a way of giving huge subsidies to large corporations, because transportation is an expense to having businesses on a very large scale. But when the government builds the roads and the road system and all that for you, then you have a huge expense taken off you. So that's actually a huge advantage that government gives big businesses compared to small local owners. So there's a lot more which could be talked about. We could talk about the role of regulations in preventing competition, etc. But the main point on this issue is that the huge concentration of capital and finance in very huge, large corporations are not a result of free markets, but rather artificial privileges given to big business on the expense of others. So it's not like we have big businesses because it's more efficient. It's actually very inefficient, but the inefficiencies are sort of hidden and given to the state, which sort of subsidizes it in all sorts of ways. So I think this insight is very, very valuable. At least I find it so. Yeah.
Yes. Wow. Many interesting points that you brought up here. I like the idea that tax-funded transportation systems are a subsidy to big business. I haven't thought about that before. It seems quite plausible. So that's very interesting. I I was reminded of a book that I have read. It's called The Collapse of Complex Societies by Joseph Tainter. And in this book, he discusses different theories of why societies even came about in the first place. And he distinguishes them into two main categories. And one of these categories is kind of the cooperative view of society, which says that society primarily exists because human beings have certain practical material problems, and they cooperate and build a structure to take care of these problems, and that actually hierarchies and inequalities and abuse of authority is all it's kind of a bad side effect of this structure, which has a good main purpose, namely solving the problems of human beings cooperatively. And the other set of explanations has more to do with exploitation. And it says more that society or the state or all kinds of institutions primarily came about because a small group of rich and influential people wanted to exploit the rest, basically. And they built all these structures in a manner to kind of hide, but still exploit in the hidden these other people that work for them. And I think back when I was an anarcho-capitalist myself, I was very much leaning towards the exploitation view of society. That basically the state and these institutions, they exist because some rich and influential people want to exploit the rest. And as I have found out that there are some fundamental flaws in anarcho-capitalism, and basically these were flaws in human nature that the anarcho-capitalists, I think, have wrong assumptions about human nature. Then I also started leaning more towards the cooperation view of society. Though I think in reality it's a mixture of both. And typically when society goes well, then it's more on the cooperation side, and as it degenerates and becomes corrupt, then it tends more in the direction of exploitation. But where would you put Carson in this cooperation versus exploitation kind of dimension?
That's a good question. Well, it seems to me that Mr. Carson, he believes that society, fundamentally speaking, is more of the cooperative dimension. It's people uniting, families, small communities and villages gathering together and doing things collectively. But he argues that the modern financial economic structures are actually sort of antisocial elements that hinder and weaken society rather than promote it. So I think he would view the modern industrial or financial economic developments as being more of a disease to society rather than being a natural part of it. So he would sort of view this, he would say that modern capitalism is very exploitative, but it's something that is artificial and antisocial and unnatural, and that society would actually be more improved and be more social in a way if you replaced it with, say, a mutualist type of society. And he actually argues, and this is a point that is actually very close to a more traditionalist conservative point of view, which I subscribe to, that if you go back to the High Middle Ages, that was actually a societal order where you had a lot of small local enterprises, and you have guilds where you had people producing things locally, and then they united themselves to other people producing things locally. You didn't have this huge financial hierarchy. You of course had feudal hierarchies, but it was not like this very artificial financial capitalistic type of business world that we have in today. And he actually argued that that High Middle Age society had actually very good developments, and if we let that continue developing on its own naturally, society would be much better. But due to this very artificial intervention by state and aristocrats, like the Enclosure Acts, Henry VIII and his intervention, etc., that destroyed this natural development and replaced it with an artificial development, an antisocial development. So that was, I think this is more his view. And this would, I would also approach modern society in sort of this way myself. It could be compared to modern architecture. You know, back in the day, you had very beautiful architecture with all sorts of very symmetric, hierarchical, beautiful structures. But then with modern architecture, you had very, I would frankly say, very ugly structures with just white walls, no decorations. And that would be sort of an artificial counter-natural thing to what it was natural before. And I would sort of agree with Carson to view modern economic development in the same way. But it might be more complex than that. It might be more complicated and more nuanced. But I think he has some good points in that regard. And I could also briefly mention that I believe that society is meant to be conforming to some sort of natural order based on natural law, because we have human nature, and human nature means we are social animals. We have families, we have culture, etc. And everything is supposed to be in a proper place. Like society is like a body with organs doing their own tasks, and if all do their tasks naturally, then you would have the health of the body, the health of society in the social sense. But the modern industrial or financial state capitalist system sort of makes society go away from this order, and thus it would be bad. So yes, that would perhaps be how I would describe Mr. Carson's view and sort of my own view to a certain extent.
Yes, there are two points I think that I have to kind of challenge, because they seem to me not so plausible. And the first is, just a little while ago you said that local production, if you have very many small local enterprises, that would be more efficient or productive than having these huge corporations. And of course, as you have pointed out, the calculation is very difficult, because, as you said, the inefficiencies of the large economic structures are hidden oftentimes in the state. As you have mentioned, for example, with the public funding of transportation systems, which is an interesting example. Though, nevertheless, I think if there is perhaps things to be said against a increased or exaggerated division of labor, but one thing that it actually does is it seems to increase productivity dramatically. And because you have just a person being specialized in doing one thing, and therefore doing this faster and better than if you have more people doing more things, then each is less proficient in each separate task which he does. So yeah, of course, one thing that you also have to point out is that with the invention of, or with the discovery of the use of fossil fuels, the possible movement just became much larger. So it seems to me just self-explanatory that in the high Middle Ages there was more small local enterprise, because the cost of building roads and the cost of transporting goods with horses and wagon was just immensely higher than it is with fossil fuel driven transportation systems, because now as a society we have basically more energy. We are perhaps less energy efficient, but as a whole we have just more energy, and therefore we can move over larger distances. And perhaps you want to say something to that before I would go to another point that I want to criticize as well.
Right, yes. So yeah, I think you have, of course, a very good point in that society before had much less energy and technology, so large-scale businesses would be far more difficult. But I think Kevin Carson goes beyond that and arguing that development in the high Middle Ages moved towards workers being more free and independent rather than very subordinate into very strict and detailed hierarchies. So I think his point was more in that direction. And when it comes to big business and productivity, well, I would still say that, and Carson points out that the amount of help that big business needs from the state in order to survive, it's very massive when one thinks of it in its totality. It needs many sorts of regulations, because without those regulations, you can have businesses compete on quality and safety instead of there being a universal standard that the state imposes. He argues that the military-industrial complex is a very, very heavy factor in producing a lot of technologies, which is later then adopted by businesses. An example is the internet was actually developed by the Pentagon and then later used in civilian contexts. He also talks about, yes, infrastructure, as we mentioned, being very essential, patents being very essential, and many other institutions and things from the state, very heavy government intervention, or else it would fall apart. And I think that shows that if those businesses were to do things on their own, it would very quickly fall down. And also another example I just thought of is research and development. That is money used for researching and developing technologies. And a lot of that money comes from government grants. If the big businesses were to finance those research and development plans on their own, it would be way too expensive. And you also have higher education being subsidized by the state, so that when they get when they get people educated with technical issues, technical knowledge and skills, now that is financed by the government instead of them funding education and skilled laborers. So there are so many sorts of government help, so to speak. Even the welfare state could be understood as a government subsidy, because now the businesses don't need to take care of giving their workers these and that conditions, and there is no longer something that can be competed between employers, because now the state takes care of that. So, and also infrastructure again. Yeah, so I think it seems to me that government intervention to help big business survive is so heavy, so massive, so deep, that the whole thing seems very, very unnatural and artificial and inefficient. So yes, that would be my remark to that.
Yes, I think when I look at it that way, then I would agree with your account that you have given now, because the danger that I think I have made a mistake of kind of comparing apples to oranges, because of course production is more efficient if you have more energy available. But the question is, would it be even more efficient with the energy available today if we didn't have all of these structures, as you have well explained, that kind of are indirect subsidies to big businesses, or are just regulatory frameworks that stabilize these big businesses and hinder any competition from emerging. So the question is not, are we more efficient today than we were in the past? But the question is, and you have pointed it out really well, if all of these things didn't exist, financed and enforced by the government, then I tend to agree that big businesses would fall apart quite rapidly, because it seems just not possible for one small group of people to know the conditions and the desired products in a large area of the world better than each person locally knows what the people locally want. And so even if you have, for example, large factories producing certain kind of like components of finished products, then still you could have a massive amount of small independent companies that buy these components and assemble them in a way that suits the local population better. Because I have often wondered, for example, many furniture that people have today come from IKEA. And IKEA is, yes, it is cheap, and yes, it is practical, but it's not, some things are good, but some things are also kind of not optimally adapted to just the way buildings are in a location, or just the style of furniture that perhaps people like in that location. And nothing would hinder a smaller company of using the same factories and just giving them a different assignment, and then producing furniture which is different but also cheap. So I see your point there.
Right, exactly. There are a lot of hidden costs behind big business that many people are not aware of. But Kevin Carson is good at pointing out that there are truly massive hidden costs and disadvantages which are hidden because the state subsidizes them, the state funds all the highway systems which they need, the patents and regulations of all sorts, and military industrial complex, and tariffs to the extent that is used in many places. And there is an historian named Gabriel Kolko who argued that the development of so-called progressive regulation in the late 19th, early 20th century was because businesses wanted those regulations to prevent destabilization in their economy. Because when a government regulates things and say, all of you have to follow these and these regulations, now the businesses don't have to compete with one another on the behalf, when it comes to these regulations, that they can compete of safety and quality, because now the government imposes a universal standard. So it's sort of a form of cartelization, because what happens in a cartel? You have all businesses in an industry coming together and saying, we're not going to compete with each other on these standards anymore. We're going to have one uniform standard among all of us. Now, big business tried to establish those cartels privately without government help, but it didn't really work because there were always outside competitors, and there were people within a cartel who broke the agreement. But then they used the state, and that would sort of enforce the cartel, because in practice, now the state promotes these uniform standards, and hence you don't have these regulations. And that's the thing many people don't know, that actually big business were pushing for such government regulation instead of fighting against. So that's also something that, say, the objectivists like the Ayn Rand philosophers they wouldn't sort of see it that way, but that's actually the case, as Gabriel Kolko argued. Yes, so I think that there are so many advantages to small businesses. You don't have all these transportation costs. You don't have all these threats that big business have and all these problems. And it's also advantages. It feels more. It feels better to have someone locally producing things. You feel more perhaps belonging to a community, and things more made by hands instead of sort of anonymously produced by some huge factory. So there are many social and cultural reasons why I think localized production is better, but actually it is more efficient, according to Kevin Carson. He actually argues also that in the late 19th century, there were technological developments that would actually make small localized production far more efficient. However, due to government subsidies like an infrastructure, that development was taken away, and rather the economy was more invested into big business developments, because that was favored by the state, and the trend toward that, because of government tipping the balance toward that instead of localized development. So yeah.
Yes, I mean, interesting points again. I was just, as you were speaking, I was reminded of this observation which many economists have made already, that there is a strong desire among people to privatize gains, but to distribute the losses over society. And I think many of these things that you have mentioned do exactly this. Because the big business, it privatizes the gains in the hands of a small minority of shareholders or high-ranking executive officers, and then it distributes the costs. As you said, the hidden costs that are carried by the state are actually carried by the whole population. And so it's a form of redistribution, but the redistribution goes from everyone to a small group, and therefore these small group get extremely rich and are extremely motivated to build and maintain such a structure. I would have an interesting question though, and I see the beauty of living in a country or a world where people would just be more letting each other live, and each would just locally produce some goods for himself and his neighbors, and it would be perhaps, as you said, a much more organic form of living together. And the question that I have is, what about the ability, or the ability in the end of large groups of people to organize their effort and their for one massive enterprise. And traditionally, war has always been a problem for human societies, and war is kind of the ultimate one-dimensional effort, where the entire country or the entire economy and everybody has to pull in the same direction, because they are afraid that another group of human beings will come and invade them and take away their stuff and kill them. And so I think many of these large structures, like having very efficient transportation systems, or, as you said, generally the military industrial complex, and also the ability perhaps of the state to set certain standards, or to set certain requirements that everybody then has to follow, it might have some evolutionary advantage for a society to develop these institutions, because when it comes to war, then a society which has these massive channels to transfer resources or to transfer material is just stronger and will win the war, and therefore take over the other society, even if life in the other society is more organic and more harmonious for the individuals.
So in other words, that the large structural organization could be beneficial in combating enemies in war, in a sense.
Yes.
Right, yeah, that's a good point. And I'm not sure what Kevin Carson would say to that, but he would at least certainly agree that a lot of the modern economic structures can be linked to war in different ways. For instance, he talks about the First World War. And what happened during that time, the war economy was very important in transforming society and making it more centralized and controlled by large structures and organizational agencies compared to before. And that the modern economy could be, to a certain degree, understood as being formed or modeled after that war economy of World War I. I think the anarcho-capitalist Murray Rothbard also argues something like this. And he would also argue that war economy is actually, that's perhaps a counterpoint in that Kevin Carson argues, and this is also, I think, generally argued by leftists like Noam Chomsky, for instance, that the war economy, going to war, is a way in which big businesses, which help big businesses to survive and be strong, because now they can expropriate resources from other countries through war. And for instance, you have all the oil interests involved in American wars in the Middle East, people will point to, and government giving grants to huge enterprises for producing technology that they then can use in war, etc. So one counterpoint could be that if your country becomes very localized and don't have these huge structures, then that prevents your country from doing something bad in war. So that's one point. Another point is that when it comes to other countries threatening to take over your country in war, this point was made by anarchist Larkin Rose, and I think it's a very interesting point, that if your country doesn't have these huge centralized structures and systems in place, then it also becomes difficult for other countries to successfully occupy your country. If you don't have all the infrastructure and highways and the huge governmental system, then it becomes very difficult for the state to actually occupy another state in practice. For instance, if let's take the Russia-Ukraine example, since very many people know that there is a war going on there. Suppose that Ukraine, in this hypothetical scenario, was just like Ukraine were in the Middle Ages. It would be practically impossible, I suspect, for Russia to actually successfully occupy Ukraine, because how would it go about occupying something which had a condition, a social, economic, cultural, structural condition that is completely alien to the way Russia and the West generally operates? So yeah, I think that's a point to consider, that it's very difficult for a country to occupy another country if you can't have these structures to occupy. Because if you go back to the Middle Ages and pre-modernity in general, war was operating in a much different fashion. It wasn't like you could have a government totalitarianistically control your country and occupy it. I don't think that was even conceivable, because society didn't work that way. You didn't have the infrastructure to do any of that. So war was more about soldiers going out to certain lands and fighting each other on the battlefield, like the battle in Waterloo between Napoleon and the British. It was more like soldiers fighting off in lands. It was not like, now we're going to take over your economy and your social structure and your infrastructure and everything, because that was not conceivable. We didn't have that type of technological condition. So I think that would actually be beneficial in that regard. So what do you think about these considerations?
There's a lot to say, because there are a lot of interesting points here. I would agree that war helps big business, and that big business sometimes actually want the country to go to war for exactly that purpose or that reason. But I still think that big systems are, it's just like if you have a big man and a small man fighting, then the big man has an advantage because he can exert more power. And in the same way, a country which has huge systems which can transport, let's say, 10 million infantry and millions of whatever, like trucks and tanks and all of this stuff, they can just do things that a country with a smaller, more localized way of existing cannot hold anything against. And so I think this idea that a country cannot be, or it's difficult to occupy a very decentralized country, I think it's true in the short term, but false in the long term. And let me explain what I mean. So because just look at the way that the settlers in the United States pushed away the Indians. So the Indians had a very localized, decentralized tribal system. There was no infrastructure to take over, but in every battle, the Westerners, with their industrial production of rifles behind them, and just by having more manpower, they just pushed the Indians back and back and gradually took over their land and kind of incorporated it into their own way of living. So they took the land and then they divided it and made farms and built houses and built windmills and whatever else they did. And in a modern scenario, Russia could just start taking away land from Ukraine and start sending Russians from their mainland and build factories there, or build farms there, or just do whatever they want with the land, and just push the Ukrainians farther and farther back. And because they have no large infrastructure of their own, they cannot bring a sufficient force against this larger army, which is just eating away their territory. Now, it is true that if there is no capital and no state taxation system, then it takes a longer while until you can control this other country. But you definitely can do it if you just take it over step by step, and you cannot really be stopped.
Well, I mean, I would still say that in that case where you have this more stronger power than invading a country which is very, very, very decentralized, if it doesn't have the technological, if it isn't on technological on even terms with the other power in terms of technology and centralization and structure, etc., that means that this new power occupying this weaker power would have to build up society to make it on even terms with itself. That's extremely expensive to build an entire country from the bottom up, according to modern standards. It would be so expensive, in addition to the whole military operation itself, that it wouldn't make sense for people to go to war, because it would be pointless. You would just have to use a lot of money, and perhaps you get benefits in many decades in the future, because it takes a long time to build up an entire society from scratch according to modern lenses. So yeah, I don't think it's not like the United States invading the Middle East for oil or some other interests, because the structure and the technology is there. For instance, the oil wells and all the technology to drill up oil is already present, and I presume that the government of the United States, when it invades, would just take over those oil technologies. And recently you had this problem with the United States moving out of Afghanistan, and then the Taliban took over many of the war technological things and entities from the United States, and this was a huge problem. So I think modern governments go to war because they know that, oh, we can just take over their technology and use it. But if they were to build societies from the bottom up, I can't imagine any country which would be willing to go to war and waste so many resources for that purpose. And also, secondly, I think that since you have a very decentralized, very localized society, that society it would be no threat to other nations. So also one reason that many countries go to war is that they perceive this new country to be a threat. I think if you had a country which just completely admitted that we are only going to war because we want to take the resources that haven't provoked us, there is no real issue involved, we just like to take the resources. I think in a modern world, I don't think they are going to get a lot of support even from their own population. And yeah, I don't think it's realistic that someone would go to war for no other reason than that and be willing to build up that society from the bottom up over many decades. So yeah.
Well, yeah, I would disagree. I think it has happened many times in the past that people can expand. I mean, I can either have a very small farm here in Switzerland and work very hard and just make a kind of even living, or I can just go and take some land from some Ukrainians who cannot defend themselves because they have, in our hypothetical scenario, a very decentralized form of society. And so I just take a huge bunch of land and have a huge farm for myself, and it will be very much more comfortable. And so people have always throughout history tried to expand at the expense of some other population. And yeah, that's the one thing. And the other thing is people build factories. All the factories that exist today were built because someone imagined that in 10 or 20 years, the factory would be a net positive. And so why not do it in a new country that you have grabbed for yourself? Even the land will be cheaper there. Perhaps there will be local resources that you can exploit. So, and I see your point that today it wouldn't be publicly acceptable in the international setting to say, well, we are just going there because we want to take their land or take their stuff. But still, I think that's the real motivation behind many wars. And then people just make up some story to justify their evil actions.
Well, I mean, I think it's more plausible that a country would try to use their own lands in their own country before going to war against another. Even if that other country is weak, it would still be easier to just deal with the land on their own place. But anyways, one could also argue that that very decentralized country could make agreements with other countries and their military forces, a little bit similar to NATO. Why not?
No, that doesn't work. Because if the decentralized country wants to make an agreement with another country, then it needs a centralizing structure which can speak for this entire decentralized country.
Yes, it could have a king.
Yes, and then it's no longer, but then it's no longer decentralized.
Oh, I'm not. Yeah, okay. I'm not saying that it should be so decentralized that there is no national government of any sort. For instance, in the Middle Ages, you had kings, you had emperors, so you would still have such structures in place.
Yes, but if, let's say, a very centralized country were to make an agreement with such a country as you have now mentioned, which is very decentralized but still has a national government, how can I really trust that this decentralized country will actually hold their word? So let's say we have a mutual agreement to help each other when we are attacked by a third country. But how will I know that from this decentralized country enough people or resources will actually come to my aid when I need them? Because there is no centralizing structure in this other country that can enforce people to actually uphold this treaty.
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be the case that the agreement is such that the stronger power demands something from the weaker power in return. Perhaps it doesn't need to be that way. Perhaps the stronger power makes an agreement with the weaker power because they both have a possible common enemy, let's say Russia, and the strong power, which is in opposition to Russia, would not like if Russia took over that weak decentralized country. So it doesn't even need to demand anything from the weak country. You can just say, well, it's in our interest to help you anyways. So
yes, that's true, but the point still remains that if other countries have a very strong military machine, let's say they are like a massive military machine, and you as an independent country have nothing to hold against this, then you are dependent from other countries either just not attacking you because they think it's not worth it, or defending you because they think it's in your own interest, but you cannot defend yourself, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understood that point specifically, that one cannot defend itself in the sense that the decentralized country would not be able to defend itself.
Yes.
Right, I mean, it would be less able to defend itself. I wouldn't say it's utterly unable, but it's less able, that's true. But yeah, I mean, even if Russia, say, would invade a country to get land, it would still have to establish the infrastructure, like the roads, etc., to make people go to that land, because it's not used to have a factory out in the woods if you don't have a highway system or something like that. So yeah, it would still be very expensive and a lot of things that Russia would have to do. So yeah, I think the costs would outweigh the benefits, realistically speaking. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. But anyways, even if we are to grant that okay, it would be a serious problem in a decentralized country. Okay, perhaps you could argue that you could have a very advanced military coinciding with a decentralized economy, that there is a way to combine those two. But perhaps that would be a separate discussion. I don't know.
Yes, I think also we have dealt long enough with the military question, but yeah, I don't know. Is there some other point about perhaps advantage or disadvantage of mutualism that you would want to bring up before we take this discussion to a close?
Well, some general remarks. One advantage or two advantages we said of mutualism, which could sort of be understood as a summing up of what we've been talking about so far, is that one, it would be a way to approach economic leftists who really dislike the current capitalist system. But you can sort of convince them that no, actually, you could have a market economy and even a very conservative traditionalist, or perhaps they wouldn't like the social and moral values in a conservative society, but they could at least possibly be convinced that a decentralized, localized society with markets would actually be something they could support. So I think that could be used as an approach to people who are more economically left-wing, and show that there is actually another alternative to the false dichotomy between either you have modern centralized finance capitalism or you have some state socialist system. Obviously, right-wing libertarians would also say, yes, our free market libertarian economy is a third alternative. But the mutualists say we can actually have a free market economy with worker-controlled enterprises, small local business owned by individuals, or I would prefer households, families own their own businesses. So I think there are many insights in mutualism which are very valuable and worth considering, and arguments that should be considered. And the second advantage is that it presents, especially Kevin Carson, presented a lot of insights to understand the modern economic system that I haven't heard really discussed anywhere else. The way in which government has artificially manipulated the economy and formed the current structure. It's not the result of a natural progress that we have these huge centralized financial systems, but it's the result of very artificial, heavy, deep state intervention. That speaks volumes on how society is and why it is the way it is, and how we could perhaps have something better than this. So I think those are two advantages or insights that we should consider. And a disadvantage is that I disagree to some extent, like you mentioned, with the idea that, like, say, workplace democracy, that's a term that leftists like to use, workplace democracy would be the best, because it seems to me natural that there are hierarchies even in businesses, that there are people who have more responsibility than others, people who are better at planning than others, like you mentioned. So I think a hierarchy and a sort of division of labor when it comes to authority and things like that are very natural in businesses. But anyways, I would prefer some sort of natural order with decentralized economies, and have families run businesses and guilds running business like in the Middle Ages. So that would be sort of what I prefer. But yes, so basically many good insights and things that are discussed there that are very true and good, but there are some disagreements as well. So that would sort of be my, I suppose, my concluding remarks about mutualism.
Yes, very well put. I would strongly disagree on the idea of guilds being a good thing. Perhaps we could discuss that in another conversation when it comes up, but I think guilds were very mercantilist in their approach, also banning other people from doing certain jobs and trying to monopolize certain activities, and thereby increasing the price and leading to a lot of suffering for other people who were excluded from the guilds. So that's just one quick remark. And I like your point about the insights into how our current economic structure didn't evolve through a free market, but through heavy government intervention. I think that's very relevant and should be studied more, because yes, it's important to know how something came about to understand also perhaps how it works and why it is the way it is. So I think that's certainly very valuable. I think I disagree on some assumptions about human nature, which I sort of sense underlie this mutualist system, namely that many people are perhaps short-sighted and lazy, or do stupid things and then later regret it. And therefore, yeah, as I have discussed earlier, And also, I think the problem of being able to hold the level of this international arms race that we have basically witnessed since the beginning of society, or at least of state society. I don't see any way out of it, and I think the mutualists will be at a disadvantage in war, and that will just basically destroy them, even if their society would be more agreeable to live in. So because yeah, these are, I think, my concluding remarks, but it is interesting, and it would be interesting to find an alternative way of economic organization which doesn't have some of the problems which we both agree that our current system has. So, but I'm not sure that this is it. Yeah.
So also, briefly, I could mention that there are also some issues we have discussed in earlier conversation about, say, accountability and a liability, that corporations are liable to certain things only in a to a limited degree, and that there are problems with the welfare state in corporations, that they externalize responsibility instead of internalizing it. That's also things that can be discussed in relation to mutualism. And also, I remember this quote by Noam Chomsky, which is sort of similar to what you briefly mentioned earlier in this conversation, that modern capitalism is about privatizing profit and socializing costs. And I think that is a good way to describe much of what is going on in the economy today and in politics. So yes, then I would say thank you very much, Amos, for having me on to discuss mutualism and related issues. I think what we have discussed is those things we have been discussing are very interesting and valuable. And yes, I would also end by saying to the audience that if you have any comments or reflections about this, let us know in the comment section. And I will just end by saying thank you again, and I wish you and the audience a great weekend.
Yes, thank you very much for introducing this theory to me and to the audience. I think it was very interesting, and yes, comments are welcome. And other than that, I also wish you and the audience a great weekend, and we will see each other next week.
Thank you.
Great. Goodbye.
Goodbye.